Welcome to Crime Most French, a fortnightly podcast covering intriguing cases carried out on French soil. Researched and narrated by Cedric and rudely interrupted by me, Melanie. We're the true crime podcast on the Alliance. Crack open le vin and let the mayhem commence.
This is episode 89, The Dreyfus Affair, Part 1. In September 1894, a letter is passed to the French military secret services that seems to show that secret documents were about to be transmitted to a foreign power. Captain Dreyfus is quickly found to be the source and prosecuted. This is part 1 of 2 because it's quite a long story. Technically speaking, it starts in 1897 and ends in 1982.
Wow, that's a long case.
It's a very long case, but most happens within 10 years or 15 years. 15
Right.
years. So in September 1894, the maid at the German embassy in Paris finds a ripped document in the bin. Apparently, it was such a normal thing to happen to maids that the secret services had a name for that. It's called the ordinary way.
Okay.
And strangely, in the whole story, the Germany and the German embassy never gets pissed off at it. It's just, okay. And that was it. So apparently it was very, very normal.
Well, that's weird.
Yes. Apparently, the maid was in fact working for the French secret services.
Right.
And she was passing the contents of the bins to the embassy, from the embassy to the French services via Commander Hubert Joseph Henry every 1 or 2 weeks in a church in Paris called Sainte Clotilde.
Yeah, this is what happens kind of like when you don't have industrial shredders on the go, I guess.
Yes, you just rip them and it's not enough.
Mm.
It was a handwritten letter. It was put back together very easily. It was in 6 pieces, so
right, okay.
6 pieces of an A4 sheet is just 2 seconds of work.
Yeah, that's not a 1,000-piece jigsaw, is it?
Yes. It describes to the German attaché Maximilian von Schwabkoppen, I think it might mean blackhead possibly, but my German is not good, that a series of documents were about to be transferred to a foreign power. It doesn't specify who, but possibly Germany, possibly someone else, Italy.
So we've got a bunch of documents that we don't know what
we know
they're
nothing about. We just have a letter that says that a bunch of documents are ready to be transferred.
Okay, so that's a heads up. Information's going to be heading your way, but we don't know what the information is, and we don't know where it's
we don't even know if it actually exists.
Yes, okay.
We have no idea. It's not dated and it's not signed. So who knows where that comes from.
Mm.
It doesn't seem like the documents that were hinted at were of very high importance.
Right.
So in itself, it shouldn't have been a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's obvious that all the embassies and all the secret services were spying on each other, and it was normal.
Yeah.
But the secret services have been suspecting for nearly a year at that point that they had a mole that was passing documents to the enemy,
mm-hmm.
and that kind of confirmed their suspicions. So suddenly it became a big deal, even if it technically the documents were really worthless.
When did you say this was?
1894.
94. So I mean that's only 20 years after the siege of Paris and stuff. So
yes.
I mean, you're talking and Germany was a very new country at that point as well. So I mean, things would have been quite tense still, I think, in Europe.
Yeah. Well, it was nearly exactly halfway between the War of 1870-71
mm-hmm.
and the First World War.
Yeah.
So yes.
Mm.
In addition to that, the war minister at the time was judged completely incompetent by the press, and he was regularly attacked and made fun of in newspapers.
Mm-hmm. He was a bit of a boob, was he?
That's what the press said, yes. So once he was informed of the possible leak, then he decided to take the opportunity to look good and solve that affair.
Right.
And then it's like, oh, look at me, I've solved that spying thing.
So I can feel a mole suddenly turning into a giant mountain at this very moment.
So he orders an inquiry to find out who the source of the leak is.
Mm-hmm.
The secret services try to narrow down the search space by profiling the potential mole. They decide that person was working for the artillery section of the army because 3 of the documents were vaguely, apparently related to artillery information.
So quite technical information.
Yeah, I think one of the documents is supposed to mention information about the secret cannon that the French army was developing, a cannon of 90 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the details were secret, but it was
Right.
a well-known thing being worked on. So it could be that the document just mentioned that, and that's pretty much it. We don't know the documents, we
Yeah.
don't know if they existed, so...
It's one of these open secrets that, I mean,
Yes.
the Nazis totally knew what the Americans were up to when they were trying to create the atomic bomb. They
Yes,
knew, and
but they didn't know the details.
No,
So
but
that is
there
the
was
same
a
for that,
race.
yes,
So yeah.
So they also decide that it must have been an intern officer,
Right.
because the documents apparently would have to come from several of the bureaus in the army, and really only interns move from bureau to bureau.
Oh, right, because
normally.
they're low level and they get shunted around.
Yes, exactly. So because there was, in the list of documents that were listed, they seem to come one from one fort somewhere near Paris and another one from somewhere else. And
Okay.
they decided it has to be an intern that goes around
Yeah.
and collects documents on his way.
Not a lazy, lardy senior
No.
officer who sits
No,
on
because
his
the army
ass
is
all day.
very compartmentalized,
Yes.
so
Yeah, mhm.
you don't move around.
No.
So quickly, the ideal guilty party is identified. It's Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He went to Polytechnique. Polytechnique is one of the now two highest schools in France that is not for the administration.
Oh, right, okay.
So ENA is for the administration, and pretty much all the high civil servants go through there.
Mm. Well, not now they don't, because
Well, it's been-
Macron
yes, it's been
closed ENA
closed, yes.
down, didn't it?
Until
Mm.
now.
Yeah.
Polytechnique with Centrale
Mm-hmm.
are the two civilian schools.
Right.
Centrale is what is now considered the civilian school.
Okay.
Polytechnique is technically a civilian school, but trains military officers.
So it's a bit like
you go in as
Sandhurst.
a civilian,
Yeah.
and you
it's a
come
bit-
out as an officer.
Okay, so this is like a bit like Sandhurst or West Point,
Yes.
I guess, in the US.
Except West Point, you have to be already in the army.
Oh, right, okay.
But Sandhurst, I think you can be a civilian. You
Okay.
can join as a civilian. So it's roughly
Mhm. Mm-hmm.
that. There was a third school called Saint-Cyr, who was for military officers who wanted to get more education.
Okay.
It was also a very highly rated school, but I don't think it exists for anything other than cavalry now. So it's really show stuff.
Yeah, because whoever uses cavalry and...
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's
In
all it
modern
does
warfare.
now. So it really
Yeah.
doesn't count. But Polytechnique and Centrale already exist.
Mm.
And Fred went to Centrale. And
Which Fred?
the one that then...
The one that went to
the US.
Silicon Valley, yeah.
Yeah, normally when you go to Centrale, before the end of your studies,
Mhm.
before your undergrad,
Yeah.
you usually have a job, because banks and insurance companies and
Of
all
course.
those come and get the best students.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, Fred decided to go to work for
Mhm.
Symantec in California instead.
Yeah.
And he now works for the Secret Services in France for the cyber espionage
Yeah.
section.
It's very difficult when you have a husband who has two friends called Fred. Gets a bit confusing.
Yes. Anyway, he was working in the artillery,
Mm-hmm.
and he was Jewish, and he was from Alsace, and he was issued from the Republican meritocracy, so not from the aristocracy, which is typical of the high-ranking army at the time.
Right.
At the time, pretty much all high officers came from the aristocracy or something very close to
Of
that.
Of course.
See, he was one of the exceptions.
Uh-huh. I mean, I think that's also pretty much same in the UK
Yeah, probably.
army. The landed gentry, the son that's the dullard, is punted off to fight keep the colonies, keep the map pink.
Yes.
Yeah. So the one who had the smarts was left at home to run the estates, and the the dullard son was sent off to,
Yes. Dreyfus was one of the exceptions.
Right.
So he didn't come from the aristocracy at all.
Okay. So
He
he was very much an outsider then.
was a complete outsider for lots of reasons. For all these reasons, for the fact that he was Jewish, because I think there were only 2 high-ranking Jewish officers in the army at the
Right.
time. So we're talking 2 out of several thousands,
Okay.
probably because he was captain
Oh, right.
at the
okay.
time.
So he was obviously very, very met their requirements. And
he was very good. He came top of his year at school at Polytechnic. So he was very clever, working very hard, very good.
Yeah, one of these outsiders that has to be 4 times better than everyone else.
Yes, and even then he would struggle in his career.
Yeah,
because of all the fact that he's so much an outsider for so many reasons.
Yeah.
At first, the fact that he was from Alsace is used as proof that something is fishy about him.
Of course.
And it's kind of weird because at the time the army had a policy of promoting officers from the East because they knew French and German and it was useful.
Yes, of course.
But at the same time, for him, they decided to turn it against him.
Yeah.
Because he knew German and therefore he must have been a German spy.
Yeah.
Which made no sense, but anyway, it doesn't matter if it makes sense.
Well, yeah, I don't know if you know off the top of the head how many times Alsace and Lorraine have changed hands between the Germans and the French.
No, well, it changed in 1871.
Yes.
And then changed back in 1918.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
Before that, I think it was French for quite a while. And before that, it was an independent duchy whatever, something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's been mostly French in the last couple of 100 years, but it's been German for 40 years in the middle.
I mean, it's very easy to confuse, streets that you see in Strasbourg as being German.
Oh, German, yeah. They speak
Bavarian.
It's a bit like in northern Belgium where they speak a kind of dialect of Dutch, which is Flanders.
Yeah, they speak Flemish and French.
Yes, well, in Alsace it's the same thing. They have their own German dialect,
the hybrid,
which is called Alsatian.
Yeah.
So it's not technically German, but it is very close to German.
Well, it's the same in that kind of like Catalan when you come through the Basque.
Oh, it's very confusing. Catalan is so confusing.
It's so different from Spanish.
Yeah, unless you know enough Spanish, and then it becomes super confusing because it's kind of like Spanish, but not quite. But it's also kind of French, but not quite.
Oh, God.
Catalan is so confusing.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's 1894. And because Alsace has been annexed by Germany in 1871, and the war was a total disaster for France, where Paris was bombarded several times.
They were eating the zoo creatures.
They were eating the zoo animals and rats, and eventually there was a defeat in 1871. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the army at that point in 1894 was just starting to get back on its feet.
Yeah.
And they were demanding gigantic investments in hardware and troops and everything to prepare the next war against Germany, because it was always going to happen.
Yes.
So an officer from that part of the country was seen as both an asset and a liability.
Yes.
So he knew German, so it was useful because he could help and he could understand what was going on. But at the same time, is he really French?
Yeah. When the shit hits the fan, he's the first one they're going to look at.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the same as in sports in the UK. When you win, you're British, and when you lose, you're Scottish.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Yes, of course.
If things went well, he was French. If not, then he was probably German.
Yeah.
On top of that, the army was manned by many aristocratic class officers, as we said. So these were usually monarchists, and they had a very deep disdain for the Republic. But of course, Dreyfus came from a Republican family.
Oh, God.
So really, he had pretty much everything going against him in the army. Yeah, he's
bad on worse. Oh, yes. No.
It's hard to see why he wouldn't want to be in the army, but his family was very patriotic, and they decided that it would be good for him to go in the army.
Patriotic, but not patriotic.
Good for him.
Patriotic, but not patriotic in the right way, I guess.
Oh, no, he was patriotic in the right way. It's just that he had lots of things against him because of where he was born and who he was.
No, not from the monarchist's point of view.
Yeah, no, I mean, he was very patriotic. There's no doubt about that. But the problem is, because he was Jewish, because he came from the East, because he was Republican, because it's just so many things were playing against him. That's really the problem. But otherwise, his record was spotless. It was also, of course, after the fall of Napoleon III in 1871.
Yeah.
So at that point, the monarchists were really trying to restore monarchy.
Yeah.
Because in the 19th century, there's been three periods of monarchy or empire in France.
Yeah.
So it was about half-half between monarchy and republic, and they want to get the republic back. But at that point is the start of the Third Republic, which, spoilers, is the one that lasted the longer until the Fifth. Yeah,
well, de Gaulle started the Fifth, and was it 67?
It was 58.
Was it 50? God, was it 58? Jesus.
Yeah, well, technically 59.
Okay.
But the vote was 58.
I mean, it does get... French history is very confusing, and everybody talks about the revolution, and there was more than one revolution.
3.
And everyone talks about Napoleon, but there was more than one Napoleon. So I mean, it's very, very confusing, and we're on the Fifth Republic now. So, I mean, I don't see that changing any time, but yeah, French history is very kind of like jumbly and a bit like British history because it stretches back so far.
Yes. Yeah, there's calls for a sixth republic, but really the fifth one works. And when you see how things work in the US, for example, where it's a presidential republic, or the way things work in Belgium or Italy, which are parliamentary republics, they're not very stable, and they concentrate a lot of power in one person, and it's not really good. Whereas the French one kind of mixes the two.
Yeah. Well, you don't. If you look at Italian politics, you initially...
It's very unstable, but...
You instantly think Berlusconi, no, that just would not...
But the Fourth Republic from 1945, technically 46 to 58, was also... It was the same model as Italy now, and it was extremely unstable. You could have 5 governments in 2 weeks. No. It was ridiculous, and that's why they decided to scrap it and go for a different system.
Yeah.
So in France, you have really 3 parts of the state, and they all balance each other much better than in the US.
Yeah, it's checks and balances, isn't it?
Yes.
It's much better.
Anyway, quickly, the pretense is replaced by the real reason. So they're saying, he might know things and he might be German. And the real reason is that he was Jewish. That's pretty much it.
Right.
It's an article published in one of the anti-Semitic newspapers at the time that really spills the beans. And from that point on, everybody stops pretending. That's really what the reason is. He's Jewish, they don't want him in the army. So that's really what's happening. So he must have been guilty of something anyway. Yeah,
God. That's not probably the best of times to pick
a
topic to do with Jewish people, but never mind.
Of course, the army can't really kick him out for being Jewish because that would be illegal, so they pretend to have some kind of inquiry, which is super thin.
All right, okay. It's another one of these kangaroo court things, isn't
it? So it focuses on his character to a certain extent. They say he's quiet, he's cold, he's haughty to a certain extent because he knows he's very good and clever.
Yeah.
He's arrogant, he's very curious, and therefore he must be guilty of something.
Wow.
That's essentially the meat of the inquiry. Most of those are exaggerated. He wasn't apparently that pretentious or that arrogant. He was just a guy who knew what he knew, and that was it.
Yeah. I mean, what kind of officer class isn't kind of like well-read and haughty and know their place? Come on. He
was curious, but at the same time, you want your officers to be a bit curious, and not just morons. So and none of this made any sense. They were just picking vague traits that he had and blowing up out of proportion and saying, that must be why what's happening and why he's a spy.
And what I'm now suddenly remembering is this is one document to say there are documents coming to somewhere. So we don't know what the documents are. We don't know what they're going. But they're now accusing this guy of being a spy. Just on this thin veil of one bit of paper.
Yes, that's the start of the story.
Right. Ludicrous.
Yes. So to make the case, because really they have nothing so far, they decide to compare the writing of the letter to Dreyfus's writing.
Right.
But nobody in the army has the competence of doing that, because at the time it was completely new.
Yeah.
And as we know today, it's most of the time bullshit.
Yep.
So, but it doesn't stop the commanding officer, who's called Armand de Paty de Clan. You can say from all the do and don in the name that he's from the aristocracy.
Yes,
to come forward and say, I can do the job.
Of course. Stand back, chaps, I can do the job.
Yeah. In a single day, on the 5th of October, he writes a report that says that even though there are small differences, the writing is definitively Dreyfus's writing.
Weren't people largely writing the same? If you were...
in reality, it didn't look the same at all.
Okay.
It didn't matter.
He was just bullshitting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Somebody had to say it, and he volunteered to do so. That's pretty much it. That's the story. The War Minister, having his corporate, of course, starts publicizing the affair. And despite the objections from some of the government, because the government was very close to the army at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the government was Republican, the government was trying to be as nice as they could to the army. There's, like in most countries, there's always been some kind of opposition between the army and the government, the politicians.
Yes, yeah.
But because it was so soon after the 1870-71 war, the government was trying really hard to be as nice as they could to the army.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of advised the army not to pursue the matters. It's not important, and it doesn't really matter. Don't push it. The army decided to ignore it and go for it anyway.
God.
So Dupaty is appointed chief prosecutor, of course, because he can do it.
This very much reminds me of when you have these films in that come from Hollywood where you have the politicians clashing with the heads of the army and stuff, like Dr. Strangelove. You can't fight in here, don't you know? This is a war room. There's always a clash between politicians and the army.
Yes.
And here's a prime example of it in reality.
Yes. And also, not all countries have an army that's Republican as well.
No.
There's lots of countries where the army would be happy to have a king because they usually get favored by the kings.
Yes.
A lot less by politicians.
Yes.
So.
Well, you just need to look at Russia and China
exactly.
and North Korea.
Yeah. So, in the meantime, the army tries to collect a little bit more evidence because the only evidence they have so far is that letter, which allegedly looks like it's written by a guy, which, if you look at it closely, you realize it isn't.
Yeah, if you look at it in candlelight in a really darkened room.
Yes. So they call on experts to work on the case, and one is called Gobert, and he was a writing expert for the Bank of France.
Right.
Because you had documents that had to be proven to be valid and authentic. So they had
if you're going to be moving large money
and wills and all that. So they had to deal with all that stuff.
Yeah.
So they had people who were specialized in doing that. But unfortunately, he's not convinced by what Dupaty was saying. He doesn't think that it's Dreyfus's writing.
Yeah.
So he publishes a report that highlights all the differences he can see in the writing between the writing and Dreyfus's writing and the letter.
Right. So this is actually a real expert between air bunnies, because as we know,
a guy whose job it is to make the difference, and he probably doesn't get it right every time, but at least it's his job. Because the other one has no knowledge whatsoever. He just made it up.
I mean, graphologists are just, the same as chiropractors. They're not really technically a thing.
Yes. So he says it doesn't look like it, and also, given the way it was found, i.e. in a bin, it's not likely that it's a trap because it was thrown away, and therefore it's the actual writing of someone. It's not like somebody was disguising the writing, because why? So he says, no, it can't be him. So, of course, the War Minister gets annoyed. So he calls on Bertillon, we've talked about him before, the guy who pioneered forensics from Lyon, who had very little knowledge of graphology. He didn't know anything about it and wasn't interested in it.
No, because it's nonsense.
Yes. At first, he's also skeptical when he looks at the writing and the letter. He said, doesn't look like it. But the army puts pressure on him to say that, yes, it is him. And he invents a new theory called auto-forgery, where someone would write a document in a way that is nearly their writing but not quite, to try to pretend to be someone else imitating their writing. That's auto-forgery.
Right, okay.
And he says, that's what Dreyfus did. He wrote, and clearly it's his writing, but he tried to disguise it as someone else to pretend that it was someone else imitating his writing.
So he added a stupid, complicated layer that was unnecessary on something which is just nonsense.
Yes, and it's completely made up, but he comes up with that explanation to be able to say, it must be Dreyfus that wrote that letter.
Oh, boo, shame on you.
There is something very fishy about Bertillon's ability to identify writing forgeries, because a few years earlier, there was a case in Le Mans where a fake will was used to rob a politician's inheritance. And Bertillon and another guy had been the experts in the case, so it went to court, and they ruled, the report was that it was an authentic document, and it turned out years later that it wasn't.
Eek.
And these two guys who were the experts for the trial in Le Mans,
Uh-huh.
are two of the three experts used by the army to show that Dreyfus was the original of the documents. So just that should have really made sure that they weren't allowed to be part of the inquiry, but nobody really either cared or paid attention, and therefore they were allowed to be the experts and say, yes, it was him.
I mean, if nothing demonstrates more that there's no such thing as a graphologist, that should be it.
Yes. So on the 13th of October, Dreyfus is called to the War Ministry and asked to come as a civilian, in civilian cause.
Ooh, that feels
That's especially for when you're an officer and you're going to see your boss, yes.
Come in your civvies.
Yes. The minister hopes to be able to get a confession out of him so that then it would prove everything the army's been saying.
And make it easy and put a bow on top of it and we can just move on.
Yes. And that would be the proof, and therefore, yes, solved, and let's move on, and we solved we found the spy. And it doesn't have anything else anyway, so you might have to try that. So he tries it, and he dictates a letter to Dreyfus to compare the writing again, which is very, very close to the actual text of the letter that they found at the embassy. He's hoping to make Dreyfus crack by making him rewrite something that he had already written and was found out for writing, even though pretty much everybody knows it's not the case. But he doesn't confess. He refuses to say it's me.
Doesn't strike me as the type of person just to fold like a cheap tent.
Yes. And at some point, Dupaty, the guy who said it was him originally, could try to convince him to commit suicide, and he even leaves him in the room with a gun on the table, waiting for him to shoot himself. And he comes back, and Dreyfus is just waiting. So he was disappointed that he didn't commit suicide.
He's clearly a very bad judge of character.
Yes, clearly, yes. And Dreyfus continues to say, no, it's not me, I didn't write that, and he claims he's innocent. So
this isn't the deer hunter, dude. Come on. I mean, this is an army officer that's, been through lots of, psychological stuff, to make sure he's made of steel. He's not going to kind of like go, oh, well, there you go. This looks like
they were hoping that he would understand that he's going to be disgraced and therefore decide to commit suicide instead.
But he's just not willing to lie down and become the scapegoat. No.
But they arrest him anyway.
Of course they do.
They arrest him for intelligence with the enemy, and he's sent to prison.
So basically espionage.
Yes.
Yeah.
His wife is informed of her husband's arrest when the army turns up at her door and starts searching her flat. Dupaty intimidates her and orders her to keep her husband's arrest a secret, because if it is known, he says, it could lead to another war in Europe. Which is probably true, but that's not a good reason. In his prison, where he's secretly kept illegally, Dreyfus is interrogated day and night to try to extract a confession. They're really trying to make him say it's him, because that's really the only thing they could have. But it fails. He still refuses to confess to anything.
My God, this guy's made of proper iron, isn't he?
Yes. And some, even in the army, are starting to say, okay, we really pushed as far as we could. We should really drop this thing, because at the moment it's not a big thing. It's still secret. Let's just forget about it. Even the head of the military prisons, the commander Ferdinand Forzinetti, starts supporting Dreyfus against his hierarchy, because he's saying that he's clearly not guilty. Why are we keeping him in prison?
I mean, all it seems to be doing at the moment is creating a schism
within the army.
Within the army,
yes. But it's still a secret at that point, except that the affair blows up because of an anti-Semitic newspaper, La Libre Parole, mentions the arrest on the 29th of October in a short article, and insists on the anti-Semitic aspect of the case. The newspaper is playing to its audience, obviously.
I think this just demonstrates how awful the media actually are, and always have been, for just creating a stink when there isn't a stink.
Yes.
And they're still doing it now.
Yeah, and the article insists that it's because he's Jewish and therefore he's a bad person, and that's pretty much the way the whole affair is going to be framed until the end of it.
Right. That's terrible.
But at that point, it becomes public, of course. And because things are now getting out of hands and the secret is out, the General Saucier, that's his name, orders a complete, not secret this time, instruction of the case.
Right.
He could have stopped the affair at that point. He could have said, yeah, okay, something happened, let's ignore it. Right. And probably nothing would have happened. But he's totally blind in his faith in the military judiciary system.
Oh, God, okay.
He's sure that things have been done right,
Oh, of
and
course.
he's really keen on proving it. So he decided to push forward. He was quite old at the time. He was in his 50s or 60s, so he would have been in the army in the 1870 war.
Right.
So he was the old school, essentially.
I don't like the way you're saying 50s and 60s are old, by the way. I have to, as somebody who's 51, I object to that.
Yes. The Commander d'Ormeshville, again, apostrophe D, so you know he comes from the aristocracy, writes a report for the prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
He concentrates more on the moral aspect of Dreyfus and his life, spending, for example, a lot of time in analyzing gossip that the army collected. His pretend visits at betting and card game circles, which he never went. Even the fact that he knows German and has a good memory, apparently that was the reason why he would be a spy.
Not because of where he grew up.
Yes. And that's what the report concentrates on more than an actual evidence, because they still can't find anything.
Isn't it just super when everyone relies on eyewitnesses
Yes.
and stories?
Well, at that point, it's not even eyewitnesses, it's
No.
gossip.
Yeah.
Anonymous gossip as well.
Yeah, totally scurrilous.
Yes. So, in fact, the actual evidence, the letter, is only mentioned in the last paragraph of the
Oh, my
report.
God.
Everything else has nothing to do with that.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, when you're trying to, build, you're trying to pin down something so large on one piece of paper.
Yes.
And a piece of paper that isn't even, saying anything. It's just announcing something that's going to happen. Then, you would want to hide it at the bottom of a document because it's just like, you have no proof of anything happening.
Yes.
There is nothing happening.
The paragraph actually says, the material evidence consists of a letter whose examination by us and witnesses show a complete similarity with Captain Dreyfus's handwriting.
So it doesn't even list what it is.
No.
In any great detail, because there
is
is no detail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, the prosecution doesn't have proof of anything it says. And that is used as well against Dreyfus by saying that he's good at covering his tracks.
Okay. He might be be a spy, so he's covering his tracks both backwards and forwards.
Yeah, so the fact that they couldn't find evidence of what they were accusing him is proof that he's guilty.
Oh, yeah. The absence of something is proof that he's doing something, of course.
He's sent to trial,
Mm-hmm.
and during the 2 months before the trial, the national press turns into a war zone between some newspapers who repeat blindly the accusations and what the War Minister says.
Yeah.
The War Minister even pronounces Dreyfus guilty in an interview for the Figaro.
Oh, this guy sounds like a giant arse.
Now that would probably make the case being thrown out of court. But anyway.
Of course, yeah. I mean, you're prejudicially influencing.
Yes. So you have the newspapers that repeat what the army says. You have the newspapers that jump on the fact that he's a Jew and therefore a bad person. And that's the case for most of the Christian newspapers at the time. One of them still exists. And the other camp is the ones that are starting to have doubts and are asking for actual proof and explanation.
Actual proof, yeah.
And they're also saying that because of the ambience in the country, because of all that, it's impossible for him to get a fair trial anyway.
Of course.
So what's the point of having a trial? We know it's not going to be fair.
Yeah.
We know it's not going to be impartial. So what's the point?
I mean, presumably it's a military trial.
Exactly. It is a military trial, so it takes place behind closed doors. So some newspapers complain that it's a way for a weak War Minister to find Dreyfus innocent and not have to prove it. The newspapers called the War Minister a coward anyway. So
he's just going to end up pushing and pushing for him to be found guilty in that case, which is just insane.
Yes, exactly. And the other camp in that respect is the newspapers who say that it has to be behind closed door because it's a military trial and that's the way it has to work. So yes, but of course the War Minister is at that point he has no choice. He has to continue anyway. So he could have stopped it earlier, but because he didn't stop it, now he has to continue. Or he has to quit and say, I'm a moron. So it's not going to happen. No minister has ever said that. So
no.
So the trial has to continue.
Honestly, he is just such a ginormous arse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But it's okay now because politicians now aren't like that.
No. So the trial starts on the 19th of December. It's pretty quick.
Mm.
From the start, the prosecution has trouble getting traction because using what?
Yeah. Traction with what?
Yeah.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
Yes, it can't deal very well with the fact that there are contradictions about whether Dreyfus wrote the letter or not.
Mm.
It also can't justify the motive.
Yeah.
Because Dreyfus was loaded.
Mm.
He had money. He had his own income separate from the army.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, during his time as captain in the army, he was making much, much more than a general.
Mm. Wow.
Because he was paid by the army, but he also had his own income. He had inherited lots of money from his parents. He had inherited from his wife's parents. Yeah. He had plenty of money. So money was not a motive for him. He had no need for more money.
There's nothing bring out the ire of an anti-Semite than a successful, wealthy Jew.
Yes, that probably didn't help him. Yes.
Poor guy.
But at least the army couldn't use that as a motive. He's been hoisted
by the fact that he's, been born into money. He can't help that.
No. And it means that the army has absolutely no motive. The only motive they have is he's a Jew, therefore a bad person. Yeah. That's it. That's all they can say because they can't prove he needed money, and he can prove he doesn't need any. They can't prove that he actually had anything bad in his record in the army. Yeah. They just had absolutely nothing against him. So during the trial, they ask, okay, why would he have done that? And they just say, don't know. Essentially, that's the answer. They just don't know why he would have done it. But they're sure he did. Yeah. But they don't know why. Also, he has a dozen witnesses in his favor, which the army doesn't have because they have nothing. They don't even have witnesses for anything. No. All they have is anonymous witnesses.
With some scurrilous gossip.
Yeah, that's all they have on their side. But the fact that he's Jewish is enough anyway. Bertillon is called to testify, of course, and he presents his auto-forgery theory. It sounds totally crazy, but that's what he explains in court. And it has a certain effect on the judges because he must have been good at wrapping things into some kind of reasonable technobabble or whatever.
Well, the thing is, he's got such a good reputation.
And he had a good reputation, yes. So the judges are kind of mostly convinced by what he was saying.
He knows what he's talking. Yeah, he knows what he's talking about. Yeah. We don't really need to listen to what he's saying too closely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The deputy chief of the military secret services, Hubert Joseph Henry. Remember that name, and we have heard of him before.
I don't remember his name.
Hubert Joseph Henry was the guy who was collecting the bins at the church from the maid at the embassy.
Oh, right, okay.
That was him.
Mm-hmm. So he was from the...
He was from the army, from the secret services.
Oh, yes, because the bins were in the...
German embassy,
yeah.
Yes. So... He's the deputy chief of the military secret services.
Right.
He also has an impact on the judge when he testifies, mostly because of his involvement originally and collecting evidence and spying.
Really. I guess he's the first port of call, isn't he?
Yes. And he swears that he knows that Dreyfus is guilty and that his services had been investigating him since February 1894. Which is not true. They were suspecting there was a leak. They had no idea how it was.
Right.
And in fact, we still don't know if there was a leak.
Okay.
But he pins it on him from the start, and therefore he says, we were investigating him, and therefore it's him. It's clearly him.
Right.
He even swears on the crucifix that it is Dreyfus. Apparently it has value, so it's like swearing on the Bible.
Oh, and this is supposed to be a military thing, isn't it?
Yes, which is weird because all religious signs had been removed from civilian courts by that point, but not from military courts.
Oh, that's weird.
Yes. Otherwise, in a civilian court, there would have been no crucifix, no Bible, no nothing. But so because it was military, there was.
And you didn't swear on the Bible?
That's never been a thing here. No.
Really? I didn't know that.
No, that's an American thing. Do you swear on the Bible in the UK? I don't think so.
No,
especially not in civilian court.
Now you got me thinking. Anyway.
At that accusation, Dreyfus gets angry and he demands to be confronted to those anonymous sources that have said that...
come and say that to my face, assholes.
But the president of the tribunal says no. By the end of the trial, things look pretty uncertain. The judges were impressed by some of the prosecution's witnesses, like Bertillon, but they're also impressed by Dreyfus's rebuttal and his factual and logical way of arguing. So he kind of logically argues out all the arguments that the prosecution has. They leave for deliberation because it's a military court, so there's no jury. It's a bunch of judges.
Yeah.
And the army gets worried that he might be acquitted. So they put together Plan B. Plan B is a secret report that has been prepared that allegedly contains 4 absolute proofs of Dreyfus's guilt. We don't know what it contains. There's been no copy kept from it. We don't have even a list of the documents it might have contained. We just know from the trial documents, from another trial's documents, not that trial, a later one, that document existed. It was passed to the judges when they were deliberating in secret, which is totally illegal. Yes. Because the defense will never have known about it. And in fact, the defense is not told about it.
I mean, that's insane. That's, like sneaking up to the jury after
when they're deliberating.
After they've done their final, the closing statements and they're deliberating.
Yeah.
And the prosecution goes into the jury room and gives them information that wasn't even in the discovery.
Yes. That's exactly what they did.
Yeah.
And also the contents of that report, because we don't know what it is, we don't know for sure, but some people who have been close to the case have said that there was a letter that was apparently from a German attaché at the embassy to an Italian attaché mentioning a source of documents called D, initial D.
Oh, dear.
So they said, clearly it's Dreyfus.
Yeah.
Apparently...
Because that's the only name that begins with a D. And we know that it's the surname and it's not the first name that they're referring to.
Yeah. It could be a random letter as well. They could have numbered all their spies from A to Z.
Yeah.
Who knows? So no, that was part of the report. Also, apparently there was some documents trying to show that Dreyfus was homosexual, which of course at the time would have been bad. There's strong suspicion that these documents were all fabricated, that none of them actually existed. But because it's under military secret,
nobody knows.
You can't check. So it's transmitted to the judges on the order of the War Minister. So he puts in place Plan B.
Yeah.
It's completely illegal, obviously, but it's completely ignored as well.
God.
So on the 22nd of December, the judges come back from deliberation.
Oh my God, that's really fast. It's only 3 days.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's 3 days in total because the trial starts on the 19th. Yeah. I don't know for how long they deliberated, but probably not that long. And they come back with a verdict of guilty of intelligence with the enemy. And the sentence is the maximum for the crime, which is life in a fortified location, i.e. a penal colony.
Jesus.
At the time it was on Guyana, because Guyana had been closed by that point. The penal colony was New Caledonia.
Oh,
so
Jesus.
It's a French island between Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. Wow.
It's now semi-autonomous, but it's still technically French because they refused independence.
That's difficult to get to.
Yeah.
Even now it's difficult to get to.
It takes a while, yeah. At that point, the government, the press and the public are convinced that Dreyfus is guilty. There's very few people who are against that ruling and in his favour.
So basically it's going to be everybody was like bursting for him to get taken down to this place.
Yes.
And spend the rest of his life.
Yes. The consequence of all that story is that the anti-Semitism increased massively in France. And it's kind of weird because France used to be a country that had very little anti-Semitism at the time.
Right.
It was in fact where most of the European Jews went when they started being persecuted in their own country. So there was very little anti-Semitism, and it was really in some very specific parts of the society.
Right.
Most people didn't have anything against Jews at the time.
No.
But that completely changed because of the Dreyfus Affair.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yes. On the 31st of December, Commander Dupaty, again, him, the guy who said he could prove by graphology, he meets Dreyfus in prison and he offers a lightened sentence in exchange for a confession. Dreyfus refuses again because he's not going to confess to something he hasn't done. On the 5th of January 1895, the now infamous ceremony where he's stripped of his military medals, his military insignias, and his sword is broken takes place.
Wow.
That's a very famous picture.
Yeah.
He continues to claim his innocence at that point. That the whole ceremony takes place in front of 20,000 people who turned up to watch. The guard that was with him in the cab, leading him to the ceremony, he's called Captain Lebrun-Renaud. He reports to the army that Dreyfus confessed of his guilt in the cab on the way.
No, that's bullshit.
In reality, we have no reason to believe that.
Of course not.
But
he just wants to cover himself in glory.
Exactly. That's what people think he was doing now. But at the time, that's another proof.
Yeah.
So he's transferred to the prison on Ile de Ré.
Yeah, right.
The prison on Ile de Ré is where you went before you went to a penal colony.
Which is really, really, it tickles me no end because Ile de Ré is a horribly expensive island now because it's just full of Parisian second holiday homers. So it just
yes,
tickles
but at the time
me.
they had a very large prison apparently.
Oh yeah. Never ever visit Ile de Ré in the height of summer. Good Lord.
Well, he's transferred there on the 17th of January, so he doesn't have the problem. And he stays there for over a month. He's allowed visits from his wife twice a week in a very long room, one at each end of the room, with the director of the prison in the middle.
Oh, God.
But the best thing is, at the last minute, the war minister intervenes to stop the transfer to the Ducos penal colony in New Guinea,
right?
In New Caledonia. That was normal destination for those sentenced to life in a fortified place since 1888. And his argument is that the conditions there are way too nice. I suspect they weren't that nice. But he says the conditions were way too nice, and there was a captain in the army that was sent there a few years earlier who managed to nearly escape.
Okay.
And he says, clearly that shows that it's not suitable for Dreyfus. We don't want him to escape from New Caledonia.
This guy's an arse.
And therefore he changes the destination to Guyana. So he, instead of going to the normal place, he goes to the old place that had been decommissioned because it was so horrible.
Oh my God. Well, we've talked about Guyana many times.
Yes, because he reinstates it. So it becomes again the place where you send people from that point on.
What an arse.
Because it had been abolished.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, in 1888. So there was no reason to send him there. And nobody was there. It was completely abandoned. So it's reinstated. And he's sent to Devil's Island on the 21st of February. He arrives there on the 12th of March. He arrives in Guyana on the 12th of March. And he arrives on Devil's Island on the 14th of April.
Just even to make it there.
He's the one resident of the island.
Oh,
because
God, poor
it was
guy.
reopened for him. So there's one prisoner and a bunch of guards on that island, and that's it.
God.
And to be sure that he doesn't escape, he's barely fed. He doesn't receive care when he's sick because he catches all the tropical diseases you can imagine.
Yes, all the dengue fevers.
Malaria and all that. So he catches all that, but he's not cared for.
He's obviously made of very stern stuff.
Oh, yeah, he was tough, probably. And he's constantly monitored by the guards that are there. That makes his time on the island even worse than most people who have been on the island.
Yeah.
It's to say something. And at some point, there's an English newspaper who announces his escape. For some reason, I have no idea where that came from.
Right.
So he's put under double lock so that
sake.
it doesn't happen, which means that you're chained 24 hours a day to your bed.
Honestly, the media are just so bad.
Yes. And at that point, he's pretty sure that he's going to die on the island.
Right.
Because he's not even allowed out at all anymore, even though he's on an island.
Oh, it's crazy. Crazy, crazy. The whole thing is just bonkers.
And that is the end of part 1.
Oh, no.
We'll stop here for now because we're already quite far into the story.
Wow.
And we will continue in part 2 in the next episode.
Oh, dun, dun, dun. Watch this space. Come back in a fortnight.